It was a quiet morning at Crestline National Bank, the kind of day where the hours stretched lazily and customers shuffled in and out with routine transactions. Jacob Reynolds, the branch manager, sipped his coffee behind the counter, his tie perfectly knotted, his polished shoes reflecting the overhead lights. Jacob took pride in running a tight ship, believing that a bank should reflect order and professionalism. A man stepped into the bank. His presence was commanding yet unassuming. He wore a plain button-up shirt and jeans, his boots scuffed from use. His skin was deep brown, and his eyes held a warmth that was hard to miss. He carried a folder in his hand, the kind of folder anyone might bring when running an errand. Jacob barely looked up. The man approached the counter and greeted him with a polite nod. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Good morning," Jacob replied briskly. He set his coffee cup down. "How can I help you today?" The man placed a check on the counter. "I'd like to deposit this, please," he said. Jacob glanced at the check, and his expression changed. He stared at it for a moment too long, his brow furrowing. The amount was significant, well into six figures. He looked up at the man, his polite demeanor now clouded with doubt. "Do you have an account with us?" Jacob asked, his tone sharper than before. "I do," the man replied evenly. Jacob's eyes narrowed. "I'll need some ID." The man handed over his driver's license without hesitation. Jacob studied it, his lips pressing into a thin line. Something about this man, his casual clothes, his calm confidence, made Jacob uncomfortable. "I'll have to verify this check," Jacob said, his voice cooler now. "It'll take some time." "That's fine," the man said with a small smile. "Take your time." But Jacob's mind was already racing. Something didn't sit right with him, and he was determined to figure out what. Jacob took the check and ID, stepping into his office. He closed the door but left the blinds open, glancing back at the man still standing at the counter. The man waited patiently, his hands in his pockets, looking around as if observing the bank's decor. His calmness irritated Jacob. Sitting at his desk, Jacob called the issuing bank to verify the check. The amount was large, too large in his opinion, for someone who walked into the bank dressed like that. "Hello, this is Jacob Reynolds, manager at Crestline National Bank. I'm calling to verify a check drawn on your bank," he said into the phone, his voice dripping with authority. As he waited on hold, Jacob glanced at the man again through the blinds. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. People didn't just walk in with checks like this, and a man like that. Jacob shook his head. The voice on the other end of the line confirmed the check was legitimate. The account had more than enough funds to cover it. Jacob's stomach tightened, but he wasn't done. He leaned back in his chair, thinking. Maybe the check was real, but was the man? Jacob returned to the counter, holding the check and ID. He stared at the man, his expression unreadable. "I've verified the check," he began. "But I'll need to ask you some questions before we proceed." The man raised an eyebrow, but his smile remained. "Sure," he said. "Where did you get this check?" Jacob asked, his tone edged with suspicion. The man chuckled softly, as if Jacob's question amused him. "It's from a business transaction," he said. "What kind of business?" Jacob pressed. The man tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor unshaken. "It's my business. I signed it over to myself from one of my corporate accounts." Jacob frowned. "Corporate accounts?" "Yes," the man said, his voice steady. "I own several businesses. This is a dividend check." Jacob stared at him, disbelief flashing across his face. "You own businesses?" he asked, his voice thick with doubt. The man's smile faltered for the first time. His eyes, warm moments ago, now grew cold. "Is there a problem, Mr. Reynolds?" Jacob stiffened. "I just need to ensure everything checks out," he said, deflecting. "You understand it's standard procedure for a check this size." The man folded his arms across his chest, his gaze piercing. Standard procedure, or do you have a different reason? Jacob flushed under the man's gaze. There's no reason other than protocol, he said, but his voice betrayed him. The man nodded slowly. All right then, I'll wait. Just as Jacob turned to leave again, the bank's assistant manager, Lisa, hurried over. She had been watching the exchange from her desk. Mr. Reynolds, can I speak to you for a moment? She asked quietly. Jacob sighed and followed Lisa to the side. What is it? He asked, irritated. Lisa glanced at the man, then back at Jacob. Do you know who that is? She whispered. Jacob frowned. No, should I? That's Mr. Davis, Lisa said, her voice urgent. He owns this bank. The words hit Jacob like a freight train. What? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mr. Leonard Davis, Lisa repeated. He's the majority shareholder of Crestline National Bank. I've seen his picture in corporate memos. That's him. Jacob felt the blood drain from his face. His hands trembled as he held the check and ID. He turned to look at Mr. Davis, who now stood watching them, his expression calm but unreadable. Taking a deep breath, Jacob approached him. Mr. Davis, he began, his voice shaky. I apologize for the inconvenience. I wasn't aware of who you were. Mr. Davis studied him for a moment before responding. You weren't aware, or you made assumptions? Jacob swallowed hard. I was just following protocol, he stammered. Protocol, Mr. Davis repeated, the word heavy with meaning. He leaned in slightly, his voice low but firm. Let me tell you something about protocol, Mr. Reynolds. It's meant to protect the bank, not to mask bias or judgment. I've worked hard to build this institution, and I expect the people running it to treat every customer with respect, no matter who they are. Jacob nodded quickly. Yes, sir. Of course, sir. Mr. Davis took his check and ID from Jacob's trembling hands. I'll be making a note of this interaction, he said calmly. Then turning to Lisa, he added, Thank you for your professionalism. With that, Mr. Davis walked out of the bank, leaving Jacob standing there, red-faced and humbled. That night, Jacob sat at his desk long after closing time, staring at his hands. He thought about the assumptions he had made, the way he had treated Mr. Davis. For the first time in years, he felt small. Not because of Mr. Davis's wealth or power, but because he had been reminded of what truly mattered: respect, fairness, and humility. The next day, Jacob made it a point to greet every customer with genuine warmth, no matter who they were or how they looked. It was a small step, but one he hoped would make a difference. And he never forgot the lesson Mr. Davis taught him, one that would shape the way he led for years to come.